this in a second, right? So that overlap becomes, and when I say overlap, I'm talking about function or mission. Function or mission becomes a barrier, right? You don't want to tread on someone else's water. You can imagine, we're human beings. These institutions are not made out of, thin air. Human beings are put in place of these institutions. Human beings have developed some of the policies and are in some sense wedded to their particular departments or their particular agencies. I'm a this agency guy, not a this agency guy. And then to have someone else from another agency come in and tell me how to do my job, you can understand. I do conflict resolution for a living, right? So there's going to be some conflict. You're going to be wedded to your particular agency, and there might be, on top of that, administrative barriers that prevent you from not only sharing information, but cooperating and coordinating objectives with other agencies, right? So administrative barriers, overlap in administrative responsibilities, this all becomes a problem. Number 3, divergent sources of constitutional authority. I'm not going to talk about that at all. Divergent sources, S-O-U-R-C-E-S, of constitutional, right? Divergent sources of constitutional authority. The Constitution says you are charged with this and you have this much power. I have no idea of what this is. Luckily for us, our president is a constitutional lawyer, so he knows exactly what that is, right? So, Constitution gives you this much power. Constitution gives you this much power. This power might be perceived as being more effective for circumstance X. So we're going to use you guys because your power is, and so on, right? So there's not an equal amount of power, right? FBI and local law enforcement, 2 different forms of power, right? 2 different amounts, if you will, or purposes. I don't want to use amounts, but 2 different sources of power. To be honest with you, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I really don't know that stuff, but I understand what it means. I can't give particular examples. So divergent sources of constitutional power, I saw that, or authority rather, I saw that pop up in the literature a lot. And then lastly, number 4, an interagency entity might not be responsive to congressional oversight committees, right? And this is very important, right? In talking about an impediment to interagency coordination, the idea is, and if you think in a pessimistic sense, and maybe not even just pessimistic, more apprehensive. To be apprehensive is to say, listen, if we're going to be talking about interagency coordination, and I think I have an image that I drew, if I incorporate it, maybe I didn't. So I'll draw it now. Actually, I didn't draw it. Okay. So if we're going to talk about interagency coordination, then it seems to be the case that there needs to be an external, a third party, in this discourse, right? So we have agency 1, right? We have agency 2, we have agency 3, we have agency 4, and we want agency 1, 2, 3, and 4 to be able to coordinate their intelligence and information and so on and so forth, right? And later we'll see there's actually laws in place now that mandate that there is this information sharing environment that is in effect, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. With respect to this, the fourth concern is that, quote, well, it's not a quote, I wrote this, I probably paraphrased it, but I've given the reference. An interagency entity might not be responsive to congressional oversight committees, right? So that if we're talking about congressional oversight, and we have this third party group, so this would be the interagency entity, right? This is the excuse me. This is the entity, the interagency entity, whatever that thing might be. This third structure might not be responsive to congressional oversight. Oversight is important, right? We want to make sure that everything is taking place within the context of the powers granted by the Constitution, the powers of the law, that there is an even distribution of power, that there are simple checks and balances, right? So the point is, we have to be careful in the formation of this interagency entity because we don't want to have an interagency entity that is not subject to congressional oversight, to be technical. Okay? So that's what we don't want, right? Cannot be immune, I guess, to congressional right. It can't be immune to congressional oversight. But you can see the power that this entity would and will have, right? This entity becomes like the clearinghouse for many, many different agencies, right? So that the agency, and not just intelligence sharing in any sense, right? It doesn't necessarily just have to be information or intelligence sharing. What we're talking about is far more than that, and we'll see in a little bit. I'm actually going to push it even further and add my own 2 cents to the literature, because I think there's an even further sense of which we can make of interagency affiliation and cooperation, because in academia we call it interdisciplinary, right? So that when we talk about interdisciplinarity, it's not simply the case that I'm a philosopher and I'm teaching philosophy with a spin, right? It's interdisciplinarity in its truest sense. I'm a philosopher, my bachelor's and my master's, my PhD, we're all in philosophy, and I am now teaching as a conflict resolutionist, studying national security affairs. Total interdisciplinarity, right? I'm not really wedded to any discipline. Insofar as I'm not wedded to a discipline, I think that it makes me a little more flexible. The idea is the same, and there's a whole bunch of literature that goes into interdisciplinarity at an academic level for the institution of academia. For the institution of government, it's like, okay, they're catching on to the idea now. Wow, academics, they got interdisciplinarity. We need to get this interdepartmental, interagency thing going, and we need this conduit. This becomes the conduit. We need the mechanism in which we can really, truly be said to be working. Not just I'm working in your department for a week and you're working in my department for a week, which I'll talk about in a second, but that we are truly exchanging information, intelligence, and so on, right? So those are the four impediments to interagency coordination. Now what we need to do is address how we go about understanding interagency coordination for the even broader understanding of creating the perfect condition for information sharing, and obviously even the more general for national for Homeland Security, right? For Homeland Security, overall security of the United States. Okay, so let's look at the next part. Again, as you can see, far more technical. This segment of the discussion is far more technical than the previous segment, because now we can apply those general concepts that I discussed, maybe 2 hours ago in the video, and really get to the nitty-gritty of how this applies to enhancing security within the U.S. So I've identified 5 ways of strengthening interagency cooperation. Again, this is just my 2 cents. It could be 8, it could be 10, it could be 50, it could be an infinite. I've gone through, and what I do, I'm not going to actually go into my process of how I do this, but what I do is I look for regularities. And insofar as I can find regularities within different .gov pages and regularities through secondary authors and other professors and other journal publications, this idea keeps popping up. This idea keeps popping up. This guy keeps talking about this. This must be a theme, right? This goes back to grounded theory. You just got to really be good at your grounded theory. So what I was able to do is, I guess you can call it, identify 5 themes of how we reinforce interagency cooperation at a federal, regional, and state level, and even local tribal level, and how that framework as a holistic structure makes us more secure. And I think once we get closer to the end of the discourse, this lecture, I'll have hopefully what I think is a really good analogy to make complete sense of all this technical stuff. Right? So 5 ways of strengthening interagency cooperation. 5 ways